Get this, people were burned alive for suggesting priests didn't magically turn bread into God, or that the entire physical world was cooked up by an evil spirit. One poor fellow was even condemned as a heretic after he was already 6 feet under. They actually dug up his bones just to make a point. And imagine being told you were going to hell for believing Jesus and his buddies were, actually poor. The Middle Ages were a wild time for beliefs, and if you stepped out of line, the consequences could be, shall we say, fiery. Thinking differently wasn't just quirky. It could be a death sentence. Church authorities were on high alert for ideas they thought could unravel society, and they weren't shy about stamping them out. From secret groups with wild rituals to scholars asking uncomfortable questions, the medieval world was buzzing with dangerous thoughts. Let's dive into some of the most common ideas that got people into a whole lot of hot water. Number 10. The Amaurians. God is literally everything, even that rock. Imagine being told that you, your dog, that table, and even the dirt outside were all in fact God. Not made by God, but actually, truly God. This was the mind-bending idea that got a group known as the Amaurians or Amalricians into a heap of trouble in the early 1200s. Their story starts with a dude named Amalric of Bena, a super smart theologian teaching at the University of Paris. Around the year 1200, he started dropping some pretty radical notions. He was deep into philosophy, especially the works of a thinker named John Scotus Erugania, and he came to believe in a kind of pantheism. That's the fancy word for God is everything, and everything is God. For Amalric, this meant that every single created thing was in its essence divine. So you could be holy just by being. This sounded alarm bells for the church. Why? Well, if God is in everything and everyone is inherently divine, then what's the point of the church? Sacraments like communion or confession, or even priests? If you are already part of God, do you really need someone to mediate for you? And more worryingly for the authorities, if everything is God, does sin even exist? If an action is done by God because you are God and the action is part of God, can it truly be evil? Amalric was forced to take back his teachings by Pope Innocent III himself around 1204 and died shortly after, supposedly from grief or humiliation. But his ideas didn't die with him. A group of followers, including a goldsmith named William and a bunch of clergy and lay people around Paris and Champagne, kept the flame alive. They apparently took things even further with some whispers, claiming they believed that those who knew they were part of God couldn't sin, no matter what they did. This was the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card for behavior. The church wasn't having any of it. In 1210, a council in Paris condemned the Amaurians. Several of them, described as clergy and laymen, were rounded up. Some who recanted their beliefs were imprisoned for life. But about 10 of them, including priests who refused to back down, were handed over to the secular authorities and, you guessed it, burned at the stake outside the gates of Paris. As an extra measure, the council ordered Amalric of Bena's books to be burned, and in a move that shows just how seriously they took this, his own bones were dug up from holy ground and reburied in unconsecrated soil, basically a posthumous excommunication. They also banned the public reading of Aristotle's works on natural philosophy, fearing it was fueling these kinds of heretical thoughts. The whole episode was a stark warning, suggesting God was too close, too identified with the messy material world was a dangerous game. Number 9, Berengar of Tours. That bread and wine can't really be Jesus, can it? Let's talk about communion, or the Eucharist. For the medieval church, this was super important. The belief that during Mass the bread and wine literally, miraculously transform into the actual body and blood of Jesus Christ. This idea is called transubstantiation. But what if someone, a really smart and respected churchman, stood up and said, I'm not so sure about that literal transformation? Meet Berengar of Tours. Berengar was a big-shot scholar in 11th century France, head of the cathedral school in Tours, and known for his sharp mind and focus on logic. Around the 1040s, he started to question the popular understanding of the Eucharist. He wasn't denying Christ's presence, not exactly. But he argued that the bread and wine didn't stop being bread and wine. He thought their substance remained, even if they took on a new spiritual meaning. For Berengar, it was more of a symbolic or spiritual presence. To him, it didn't make logical sense for the physical properties of bread and wine to be there if their actual substance had vanished and been replaced by flesh and blood. He felt that Christ's body was in heaven and couldn't physically be on thousands of altars at once. This was like dropping a theological bomb. The teaching of transubstantiation, while not yet super formally defined as it would be later, was becoming central to church doctrine and popular piety. It underscored the power of the priesthood. Only ordained priests could perform this miracle. To question it was to question the very core of Christian worship and the authority of the Church. His views caused an uproar. Several synods and councils starting around 1050 condemned his teachings. He was called to Rome, pressured, and forced to recant his views multiple times. One famous showdown was at a council in Rome in 1059 where he was made to sign a confession stating that the bread and wine are the true body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ, and are sensibly, not only in sacrament but in truth, handled and broken by the hands of the priests and pressed by the teeth of the faithful. Pew. That's pretty graphic. Berengar would often retract his recantations once he was out of immediate danger, or he'd rephrase his beliefs in ways that still didn't quite align with the official stance. His main opponent was Lanfranc, later Archbishop of Canterbury, and they had a long, fiery, intellectual battle. The controversy raged for decades. Berengar was a slippery fellow, always trying to use logic and reason to defend his position, which frustrated his opponents who relied more on tradition and authority. Finally, at another Roman council in 1079, under Pope Gregory VII, Berengar was forced into a more definitive recantation. He agreed that the bread and wine were substantially changed into the body and blood of Christ. After this, he retired from public life and lived in seclusion on an island near Tours until his death in 1088. While Berengar himself wasn't burned at the stake, his persistent questioning forced the Church to clarify and solidify its doctrine on the Eucharist. The debates he sparked paved the way for the formal definition of transubstantiation at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. He showed that even within the Church, intellectual wrestling with core tenets could lead you down a path labeled heresy. Number 8. The Joachimites. The end is nigh, and a new age is coming without the Pope. A medieval monk, a mystic poring over the Bible, especially the super cryptic book of Revelation. He comes up with a mind-blowing prophecy. History is divided into 3 ages, and the current one, run by the Church as everyone knew it, was about to end, making way for a brand new super-spiritual era. This was Joachim of Fior, and his ideas, while not entirely heretical in his lifetime, went on to inspire a movement that definitely got into hot water. He even crunched some numbers and predicted this third age would begin sometime around 1260. Now Joachim himself was respected, and Pope Innocent III even gave his writings a cautious nod. The problem wasn't so much Joachim, but what some of his more radical followers, often called Joachimites, did with his ideas after he died. As the 1250s rolled around and 1260 approached, excitement and anxiety grew. Some groups, particularly among the spiritual Franciscans, we'll get to them, latched onto Joachim's prophecies. They saw the corruption and wealth in the established church as signs that the age of the Son was indeed failing, and that the age of the Spirit was imminent. They believed they were the new spiritual men destined to usher in this new era. One particularly explosive moment came with a friar named Gerard of Borgo San Donnino. In 1254, he published a book called Introduction to the Eternal Gospel, essentially claiming Joachim's writings were this new eternal gospel for the coming Third Age, and that it would supersede the Old and New Testaments. Whoa! This was a direct challenge to the Bible's authority and the Church's role as its interpreter. He also reportedly identified Emperor Frederick II, a notorious enemy of the papacy, as the Antichrist and predicted the existing Church would collapse. The Church authorities, particularly at the University of Paris, freaked out. A commission examined Gerard's book and condemned it in 1255. Pope Alexander IV confirmed the condemnation. Gerard was stripped of his Franciscan habit and sentenced to perpetual imprisonment in chains, where he died some 18 years later, unrepentant. Even though Joachim himself was never officially declared a heretic, though some of his specific Trinitarian views were condemned by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, separate from his prophecies, his followers who took his ideas to extremes faced serious consequences. The idea that the established church was on its way out, to be replaced by something new and more spiritual, was deeply threatening to the powers that be. It fueled apocalyptic expectations and critiques of the church for centuries, showing how prophecies of a perfect future could be seen as a dangerous attack on the present. Number 7. The Fraticelli, when wanting the church to be, "Poor got you burned." Picture this. You're a monk, a follower of Saint Francis of Assisi, who famously gave up all his worldly goods to live a life of extreme poverty. You take this vow of poverty really seriously. So seriously, in fact, that you start looking at the immense wealth and power of the Pope and the wider Church and think, this doesn't look very Christ-like or Franciscan. This was the dangerous thought that led a group known as the Fraticelli, or Little Brethren, down the path to heresy. The Fraticelli were a radical offshoot of the Franciscan order that emerged in the late 13th and 14th centuries. The Franciscans themselves had an internal tug-of-war going on. The conventuals were okay with a more moderate interpretation of poverty, allowing the order to own property collectively and use it for their ministry. But the spirituals, and later the Fraticelli, who took these ideas to an extreme, insisted on the absolute poverty practiced by Francis himself, no possessions individually or collectively. They believed Christ and his apostles owned nothing, and that this was the only true way to follow him. So far, so devoted, right? But here's where it got dicey. The Fraticelli didn't just practice radical poverty. They started to preach that the established church, with its land, its riches, and its politically powerful popes, had strayed from the true path. Some even began to claim that any pope or cleric who didn't adhere to this strict ideal of poverty was not legitimate. Things came to a head under Pope John XXII in the early 14th century. He was not a fan of these radical poverty preachers. In a series of papal bulls, official proclamations, in the 1320s, he condemned the spiritual Franciscans' core belief that Christ and the apostles had no possessions. He declared it heretical to assert that it was wrong for the church to own property. For the Fraticelli, this was a devastating blow. The Pope himself was telling them their foundational belief was wrong. Many Fraticelli refused to back down. They argued that Pope John XXII was the one in error, and some even went so far as to call him a heretic or the Antichrist for opposing the true gospel poverty. This, as you can imagine, did not go over well. The Pope declared the Fraticelli heretics and unleashed the Inquisition against them. Many were arrested, interrogated, and imprisoned. Those who remained defiant faced the ultimate penalty. For example, in 1318, 4 spiritual Franciscans were burned at the stake in Marseille for refusing to accept the Pope's rulings on poverty and the authority of their superiors. Throughout the 14th century, particularly in Italy and southern France, Fraticelli communities were hunted down. It's a pretty wild situation, monks being persecuted by the church for trying to be too Christ-like, at least in their interpretation of poverty. Their story highlights the massive tension between spiritual ideals and the institutional realities of the medieval church. For the Fraticelli, poverty wasn't just a personal choice. It was a theological statement about the nature of the true church. And for the papacy, that statement was a dangerous challenge to its authority and legitimacy. Number 6. Bogomilism, the cosmic battle of good V's. Evil and Satan was winning, sort of. Long before the famous Cathars of southern France, another group in Eastern Europe was wrestling with a very old, very troubling question. If God is all good and all powerful, where does evil come from? Their answer was radical, dualistic, and got them into a world of trouble with both the Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. Meet the Bogomils. Emerging in Bulgaria in the 10th century, supposedly founded by a priest named Bogomil, which means dear to God, this movement spread across the Balkans and even into the Byzantine Empire. At the heart of Bogomilism was a belief in dualism. The idea that the universe is a battleground between two opposing principles, a good God and an evil force. But their dualism was a bit specific. They believed the good God created the spiritual world, heaven, angels, souls, but the entire visible material world, the earth, human bodies, plants, animals, was the creation of an evil being, often identified as Satan, the rebellious elder son of God, or sometimes a fallen angel. According to some Bogomil myths, Sataniel tricked God or was allowed to fashion the physical realm and then trapped divine souls, angels, into human bodies. So, humanity was essentially divine sparks, imprisoned in evil matter. Unsurprisingly, both the Byzantine emperors and the Orthodox Church, as well as Roman Catholic authorities in areas like Bosnia where Bogomilism became strong, saw them as a profound threat. They were accused of undermining social order, rejecting legitimate authority, both secular and religious, and leading people astray with dangerous doctrines. Persecutions were common. Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos famously had Basil the physician, a Bogomil leader, burned at the stake in Constantinople around 1111 after a long interrogation, and a sneaky trick where Alexios pretended to want to become a disciple to learn all their secrets. In Serbia, Stefan Nemanja launched campaigns against them in the late 12th century. The Bosnian Church, which had Bogomil leanings, was a constant source of concern for the papacy, leading to crusades and pressure. Despite centuries of persecution, Bogomil ideas persisted, influencing other dissident movements like the Cathars in Western Europe. They represent one of the most significant and widespread dualist heresies of the Middle Ages, a stark alternative worldview that saw the everyday world not as God's good creation, but as a trap laid by a cosmic villain. Number 5. The Brethren of the Free Spirit, so holy you can't sin, even when you're sinning. Imagine a belief so liberating or so terrifying, depending on your view, that it told you once you reached a certain spiritual state, you were incapable of sinning. Literally, nothing you did could be considered a sin anymore. This was the core electrifying idea of the movement known as the Brethren and Sistren of the Free Spirit, which popped up across Northern Europe from the 13th to the 15th centuries. These weren't necessarily an organized church with a central leader. Instead, it was more like a scattered collection of individuals and small groups, often mystics, lay people, and even some clergy who shared a set of radical ideas about union with God. They believed it was possible to achieve such a perfect, direct union with the divine in this life that one became essentially like God, or even indistinguishable from God. And once you hit that spiritual jackpot, the normal rules just didn't apply to you anymore. Here's where it got really controversial. If you're one with God, and God is perfect, then how can you sin? The Free Spirits argued, you couldn't. What looked like sin to an outsider, say theft, lying, or even sexual acts outside marriage, wasn't sin for the liberated soul, because their will was perfectly aligned with God's will. Some apparently taught that if nature prompted an act, it was God's prompting, and therefore good. If you have a direct line to God and are already perfect, why do you need priests, sacraments, confession, or the institutional church? Many Free Spirits believed they had transcended the need for these external props. The church was for the imperfect, not for them. They often saw themselves as an enlightened elite, far above the common, unenlightened masses still stuck in traditional religious practices. Antinomianism. This is the fancy term for being against laws or moral codes. The Free Spirit movement is often seen as a prime example of antinomianism in the Middle Ages. If you're free in spirit, you're free from the law. These ideas, as you can imagine, sent shockwaves through the medieval church establishment. This wasn't just a theological quibble. It struck at the very foundations of morality, social order, and church authority. Church councils and inquisitors repeatedly condemned their teachings. The Council of Vienne in 1311 to 1312 issued a strong condemnation of errors attributed to Beguines, lay religious women, some of whom were associated with Free Spirit ideas, though not all, and Bigards, their male counterparts. One of the most famous cases linked to the Free Spirit movement is that of Marguerite Porete. She was a French mystic who wrote a book called The Mirror of Simple Souls. This book described a soul so annihilated in God's love that it becomes free from virtues, commandments, and the Church's control. Despite warnings, Marguerite refused to stop circulating her book or renounce her ideas. She was tried by the Inquisition in Paris and burned at the stake as a relapsed heretic in 1310. Her book, however, continued to circulate secretly, sometimes even mistaken for an orthodox, mystical text. The Brethren of the Free Spirit were often accused of leading scandalous lives, engaging in licentiousness, and promoting social anarchy. How much of this was true and how much was hostile propaganda is hard to say, as most of what we know about them comes from their persecutors. But the very idea that one could be too holy to sin, and therefore above the Church and its laws, was enough to make them a prime target for heresy hunters for centuries. They represent a fascinating, if shadowy, undercurrent of radical mysticism that pushed the boundaries of acceptable belief to their breaking point. Number 4. The Hussites' Bohemian Rhapsody of rebellion and a fiery end for their leader. Imagine a whole kingdom getting behind a priest who dared to challenge the Pope and call out corruption in the Church. This wasn't just a few scattered individuals. It was a national movement that shook Central Europe to its core. This was the story of the Hussites, followers of the Bohemian reformer Jan Hus, whose fiery preaching led to his own fiery death and a series of bloody wars. Jan Hus, born around 1370, was a popular preacher and rector of the University of Prague in Bohemia, modern-day Czech Republic. He was heavily influenced by the writings of the English reformer John Wycliffe. We'll get to him. Hus wasn't initially trying to break away from the Church, but he was passionate about reform. He thundered against the wealth, immorality, and simony, buying or selling church offices of many priests and bishops. He believed clergy should live moral, exemplary lives. He argued that Christ, not the Pope, was the true head of the Church. He questioned the Pope's absolute power, especially when the Pope seemed corrupt or ungodly. Like Wycliffe, Hus was outraged by the sale of indulgences, documents that supposedly reduced time in purgatory. He saw it as a cynical scam to raise money. This became a huge rallying cry. Hus and his followers believed that lay people, not just priests, should receive both the consecrated bread and wine during communion, known as Eucharism, from the Latin for in both. At the time, only priests typically drank the wine. For Hussites, this was about equality and fully partaking in the sacrament, as Christ intended. Hus's preaching resonated deeply with the Bohemian people, tapping into both religious piety and a growing sense of Czech national identity against German influence in the region. He gained powerful supporters among the nobility and the common folk. The church authorities were, predictably, not pleased. Hus was excommunicated, and Prague was placed under interdict, meaning most church services were banned. To resolve the growing crisis, and a major schism where there were 3 rival popes, the Council of Constance was convened in 1414. Hus was summoned to attend, promised safe conduct by the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund. Trusting this promise, Hus went big mistake. Once there, his safe conduct was revoked. He was imprisoned, put on trial for heresy, and pressured to recant his teachings. Hus refused to renounce beliefs he felt were true to the Bible, unless he could be proven wrong from Scripture. On July 6, 1415, Jan Hus was condemned as an obstinate heretic and handed over to the secular authorities. He was burned at the stake, reportedly singing hymns as the flames rose. His ashes were gathered and thrown into the Rhine River to prevent his followers from having any relics. If the council thought this would stamp out his movement, they were dead wrong. Hus's execution turned him into a martyr and national hero in Bohemia. It ignited the Hussite Wars, 1419 to 1434, a series of conflicts where Hussite armies, using inimited tactics like wagon forts, repeatedly defeated crusades sent against them by the Pope and Emperor. The Hussite movement itself wasn't monolithic. It split into factions, from the more moderate Utraquists, who mainly wanted communion in both kinds and some reforms, to the radical Taborites, who rejected much of church hierarchy and doctrine, aiming for a more communal, biblically based society. Eventually, compromises were reached with the more moderate Hussites. The Compacts of Basel in 1436 allowed communion in both kinds in Bohemia, a major concession. But the Hussite legacy was profound. It was one of the first major successful challenges to papal authority on a national scale, a precursor to the larger Protestant Reformation a century later. And it all started with a preacher who dared to say the Church needed to clean up its act and listen more to the Bible than to worldly power. Number 3. Lollardy, the one where they wanted an English Bible and said priests weren't magic. Imagine living in a time when owning or even reading the Bible in your own language could get you branded a dangerous radical and potentially burned at the stake. This was the reality faced by the Lollards' followers of the English theologian John Wycliffe, who dared to challenge some of the most fundamental beliefs and practices of the late medieval church in England. John Wycliffe, an Oxford scholar in the mid to late 14th century, was the intellectual powerhouse behind Lollardy, a nickname that might have come from a Dutch word meaning mumbler or mutterer, used as a term of abuse. He started by criticizing the wealth and temporal power of the church, arguing that the clergy should live in apostolic poverty. But his ideas grew much more radical over time. Wycliffe himself, though his teachings were condemned, some during his lifetime, more extensively after his death, managed to die of natural causes in 1384. But the church's wrath came down hard on his followers, the Lollards. In 1401, the English Parliament passed the De Heretico Comburendo on the burning of heretics statute, specifically targeting Lollards. This law authorized the secular authorities to burn convicted, unrepentant heretics at the stake, and burn they did. William Saltrey, a priest, became the first Lollard martyr under this law in 1401, burned for denying transubstantiation. Over the next century and a half, many Lollards, both clergy and laypeople, including women, faced persecution. They were often humble folk, artisans, merchants, even some gentry who met secretly to read Wycliffite texts and smuggled English Bible portions. One famous Lollard uprising was led by Sir John Oldcastle in 1414. It was quickly and brutally suppressed, and Oldcastle himself was later captured and executed in a particularly gruesome way, hanged and burned. Despite persecution, Lollard ideas never completely died out in England. They went underground, simmering beneath the surface, and some historians argue that Lollardy helped prepare the ground for the English Reformation when it arrived in the 16th century. They were the original English Bible thumpers, and they paid a heavy price for wanting to read God's Word in their own tongue, and for questioning whether a priest really held God in his hands. Number 2. Waldensianism, the poor men of Lyon, who just wanted to preach, and got hunted for centuries. What if your big crime was wanting to live a simple poor life like Jesus and his apostles, preach the gospel directly to ordinary people in their own language, and take the Bible really, really seriously? Sounds pretty devout, right? Well, for Peter Waldo and his followers, known as the Waldensians or Poor Men of Lyon, these very actions led to centuries of relentless persecution by the medieval church. The story starts around 1173 in Lyon, France, with a wealthy merchant named Peter Waldo, or Valdez. According to tradition, he was deeply moved by a story of a saint who gave up everything, or by hearing a minstrel sing about Saint Alexius. Whatever the trigger, Waldo had a spiritual crisis. He decided to give away his wealth, after ensuring his wife and daughters were provided for, pay to have parts of the Bible translated into the local vernacular language, Franco-Provençal, and dedicate himself to a life of poverty and preaching. Soon, a group of followers gathered around him, inspired by his example. They called themselves the Poor in Spirit, or Poor Men of Lyon. They wandered around, often in pairs, preaching in streets and homes, emphasizing voluntary poverty, the authority of the Bible, and the importance of living a moral life. They rejected oaths, lies, and often opposed capital punishment. Initially, Waldo even sought approval from the Pope. Around 1179, he and some followers went to the Third Lateran Council in Rome. Pope Alexander III was reportedly impressed by Waldo's vow of poverty, but was wary of them preaching without permission from local bishops. The council ultimately ruled that they could only preach if invited to do so by the local clergy. This was a problem. Many local bishops were not keen on untrained lay people, especially ones criticizing clerical wealth and worldliness preaching in their dioceses. The Waldensians, believing they had a divine call to preach the gospel, continued to do so, with or without permission. This defiance set them on a collision course with the church hierarchy. In 1184, at the Synod of Verona, Pope Lucius III officially condemned the Waldensians as heretics, lumping them in with other groups like the Cathars. The main charges: preaching without authorization, questioning the exclusive role of the clergy in interpreting Scripture, and their developing critiques of church practices they deemed unbiblical, like prayers for the dead, purgatory, and some sacraments as administered by unworthy priests. From then on, the Waldensians were relentlessly hunted by the Inquisition and faced brutal persecution across Europe, in France, Italy, Germany, Austria, and Bohemia. They were forced into hiding, often retreating to remote alpine valleys in Piedmont, Italy, and Dauphine, France. They developed a kind of underground church structure with their own traveling ministers called barbs, uncles. What made them so dangerous in the eyes of the church? Despite massacres, burnings at the stake, and forced conversions, the Waldensians showed incredible resilience. They survived throughout the Middle Ages and, remarkably, their movement still exists today, having joined the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. They are considered one of the oldest evangelical churches. Their story is a testament to the power of a simple, biblically focused faith that dared to exist outside the official structures, and the terrifying lengths the established powers would go to try and stamp it out. Number 1. Catherism, the good God, vs. bad God smackdown that led to a crusade. Of all the heresies that terrified the medieval church, Catherism was perhaps the scariest, the most widespread in certain areas, and the one that prompted the most brutal response. a full-blown crusade on Christian soil. Because the Cathars, also known as Albigensians, after the town of Albi in southern France, one of their strongholds, had a belief system so radically different from mainstream Christianity that it seemed to threaten the very fabric of creation, society, and salvation as the Church understood it. Catherism flourished in the 12th and 13th centuries, particularly in Languedoc, southern France, but also in parts of Italy, Germany, and Flanders. It attracted people from all walks of life, from peasants to nobles. Their perfects, men and women who had received the consolamentum and lived extremely ascetic lives, were widely respected for their piety and austerity, a stark contrast to some of the worldly and corrupt local Catholic clergy. The Catholic Church tried preaching and debates, sending figures like Saint Dominic to convert them, but with little success. The Cathar worldview was just too compelling for many. Finally, Pope Innocent III, seeing Catherism as a mortal threat, decided on more drastic measures. After the murder of the papal legate Pierre de Castelnau in Cathar territory in 1208, he launched the Albigensian Crusade, 1209 to 1229. This was a brutal, bloody conflict. Armies from northern France, spurred on by promises of land and spiritual rewards, swept through Languedoc. Massacres were common. One of the most infamous was at Béziers in 1209. When asked how to distinguish Cathars from Catholics in the city, the papal legate Ernaud, Amaury, supposedly uttered the infamous words, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Whether he actually said it or not, the city was sacked, and thousands were slaughtered. The crusade devastated Languedoc, broke the power of its local nobility, who had often tolerated or even protected Cathars, and brought the region firmly under French royal control. It was followed by the systematic establishment of the Papal Inquisition, which meticulously hunted down remaining Cathars for decades. Suspects were interrogated, sometimes with torture, and unrepentant or relapsed Cathars were handed over to secular authorities to be burned at the stake. The fortress of Montsecours, a last major Cathar stronghold, fell in 1244, and over 200 Cathar perfects were burned alive there in a massive pyre. By the early 14th century, organized Catherism was largely extinguished, though its echoes lingered. It remains one of history's most dramatic examples of a counter-church, a completely alternative Christian vision that was ultimately and ruthlessly crushed by the dominant religious and political powers of the age.